FDR had the idea of the four freedoms. I'm sure you've memorized them, but let's recount. Freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from fear, big one for FDR, and freedom from want. Freedom from want, it seems like maybe not so much a freedom, but it does get at Isaiah Berlin's idea of negative liberty. Now, choice has become more than a freedom, more than a feeling. It's a bit of a way of life, but maybe it's not what's making us most free. Sophia Rosenfeld is the author of The Age of Choice, a history of freedom in modern life, in which she argues that choice is something like the meeting point of democracy and human rights culture and consumer culture. Professor Rosenfeld, welcome to The Gist.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I want to jump right in, and the book lays the predicate and takes the listener along, and we're oriented, and we're going to get to all that. But I want to start at just the most exciting, scintillating event in the book. I, of course, speak of the Pontefract by-election of 1872. Is that right?
One of the more obscure dates and places, I might add, in modern history. But
so yeah. What was going on in Pontefract? Is a hamlet in England?
It's in Yorkshire. It's in northern England. That was a town associated with coal mining. It's not a place people talk about a whole lot. But I think something really rather remarkable happened there in the 1870s. And that was the first required election in which everybody was required to use a secret ballot to vote.
And why is that an important touchstone in the history of choice?
Yeah, so we tend to think that the age of revolutions, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, gave us political choice because you find the word all over the place. But the idea in the 18th century was really that the people kind of collectively, and by people I really mean, sort of white men with some property standing for their households, would come to a consensus about what was right. It didn't mean what we think of as choice. Each person privately trying to figure out what they most believe themselves and reporting that information so it could all be aggregated later. And the switch to the secret ballot, which happens rather suddenly in the late 19th century and into the 20th, and is now the kind of gold standard for elections around the world, was the moment, I think, in which the modern understanding of voting as choosing just what you want without consulting other people based on your interior sentiments and values, so it could be added up later, came to fruition.
Does this reflect other trends in choice or ideas of choice, the progression of our concept of choice that you document in the book?
Absolutely. And what's so interesting is that it's actually really late in the day. All sorts of other domains started to have choice that looked like this modern form of voting well before politics. So you had, in the late 18th century, for instance, you have the invention of shopping, which is a brand new word in the 18th century. And it really meant this thing where you went into a store and goods were displayed and you looked at them, a kind of a menu of options, and decided, I like the blue better than the red, or I like stripes better than flowers. And was sort of a first version of this. Another early version had to do with the realm of ideas. And in the aftermath of the Reformation, the possibility of, in a sense, picking what you believe, something we talk about a lot today. And there are other versions. Another one has to do with employment and even romance. The idea that you could select a mate was a pretty new idea.
The romance part of the book is great. By the way, shopping being a new word, there was the word for shops with the E on the end, ye old, right? That was a store. Right. And so shopping just is constructed retroactively from the idea of a shop. And it just means going to a shop or looking at a shop.
Well, it does. But what it really means, shops are an increasingly common thing in the late 18th century. It doesn't mean anybody failed to buy anything before then. People had markets going back to antiquity. But generally, you went to a market, you asked for something, and it was given to you. But the shop became this fixed location thing that you could find in Paris or London, but also soon in places like the backwaters of Virginia and Massachusetts too, in which there was a fixed location in which goods were increasingly displayed so you could see them. And shopping becomes not just buying or not just, sort of getting what you need, but this thing we're all very used to. We do it even online still, looking through lots of things, comparing what do you like, what's the price tag, what's, which has good quality, and then finally making up your mind, but not starting with that decision.
And it doesn't surprise me that politics would lag culture. That's how it usually is. It's not as if a political idea is innovative. In fact, in trying to sell people on a political idea, there's usually an analogy to other walks of life. So you might say, look, we do everything online. Why shouldn't we vote online, right? It wouldn't be the other way around. Like, I've just invented this idea of online choice, and we're going to debut it with in the realm of voting. But when the Pontefract by-election happened, was it also encapsulating ideas of the personal and the individual over the collective as a point of emphasis, as what we valorize societally?
I think that's right. And I would agree that politics tends to follow rather than lead, although our political mythologies often have it that sort of democratic ideals were announced and then we enacted them, which really isn't quite what happened.
Right. It wouldn't. It in fact doesn't make sense. If they're democratic ideals, how do we decide on them as a democracy? Yeah. And then we follow them retroactively? Yeah.
Right. So, and the other thing that happens in the 19th century and into the 20th is the electorate keeps expanding. People who've been previously left out are included. And as more and more people have this thing, suffrage, as a right, there are more and more questions about, well, how are we going to decide? And some people are worried there's going to be too much pressure from bosses and landlords on the little guy. But other people are worried that the little guy is going to collude with some other little guys. And maybe we're better off putting everybody in a kind of isolation booth to do this business if they have to go about making our political decisions. So it's not always a progressive move either. And I think, what you're saying is absolutely right, that over time, this idea that the individual has certain kind of interior values that they need to actualize by making some kind of choice, and that this is what freedom actually feels like, extends itself all the way to politics. Until to this day, we can't actually imagine voting a different way. But this was controversial as late as the 1890s.
Well, an important part of that, expanding the idea of voting, is the suffragettes. And if women were allowed to vote, but we could monitor who they were voting for, there is the very real possibility that all they would be a proxy for their husbands. And by the way, that largely is how it works out. Families have similar feelings. In America, because we're talking about Pontefract in Yorkshire, in America, there was the 14th, 15th, 16th Amendment, voting rights of former slaves. And there are all these stories where even if voting was allowed, it would be done in public. Members of the town establishment would be there to intimidate anyone out of the idea for voting. I guess back then it would be for the Republicans. So as the idea of who gets to vote expanded, it also did influence the importance of the secret ballot.
Absolutely. And I think women getting the vote had something to do with the secret ballot already being in place. It made voting seem more like other activities. And it was something women had already been doing for a long time, particularly in the realm of shopping. They'd been sort of tainted by association with this act. It didn't happen quickly, and it took decades more, like most social movements do. But in some ways, the turn to the secret ballot paved the way, I believe, for women voting. And I don't know if you noticed this, but even this week, the question of women voting is back in conversation with, the Secretary of Defense Hegseth posted something from a pastor who argued for the old notion that heads of households should really be the people voting, not women.
Yeah. It seems like some of this was settled, but I guess when that's your pastor, let's open her up again. Your book is not explicitly a feminist look at history, but of course you're a woman, and I didn't even realize it so much in reading the book, but now so many of the touchstones of choice were based on, well, you have all of the stuff about courtship, which is first shown as Hercules facing a choice, but then there are the coquettes who are facing choices, and I was just constantly thinking about Pride and Prejudice. There was shopping. There were menus, which were important, especially since much of the not cooking outside in the public sphere, but in the home sphere, that was done by women. And now we're talking about women voting. Is there something, and I want to spend much of this interview talking about reproductive rights, but is there something about choice inherently tied up to the genders, very fundamentally tied up in a way that maybe you realize when writing the book?
I didn't actually start out thinking this would be a book with so much emphasis on women. And it's not a book about the history of feminism, as you say. But I just got, the more I read, the more I was struck. Women are all over this story. And partly it's because in the beginning, when they are the first shoppers picking these two kinds of fabrics or two kinds of ribbons, it's easy to sort of dismiss them as making insignificant, unimportant choices in a not important realm. And as you say, Hercules, the model of Hercules' choice is something quite different. It's this guy who's making the most important kind of choice between doing the right thing or doing the wrong thing. And it's allegorized as him picking between a woman who's a temptress or a woman who represents, the virtue, you might say. Mm-hmm. And that gives way to this kind of more silly notion of the coquette's the one who's like, I picked the blue ribbon, what difference does it make? And it's not a serious model. But over time, more of our choices look like those of the coquette than they do those of Hercules. Most of the choices we make in everyday life, do I want the ham sandwich or the BLT, are a lot more like the coquette's choice than they are like there's a right answer and a wrong answer to a scenario of choice. And women over time seize on this kind of disconnect. And so a lot of feminism, you mentioned the suffragettes, but onwards too, all the way to second wave feminism and Betty Friedan, is framed around this notion women need more choices in more different spheres. They need choice in employment. They need choice in education. They need choice in whether even to get married or have children in the first place. And interestingly, feminism kind of capitalizes on liberalism to become framed around choice. So I just saw this possibility that you could really think about the broader problem of choice in our society a lot by looking at these kinds of areas in which gender as well as other things are at play.
When did choice begin to be so associated with freedom? It wasn't always so fundamental to freedom. It might be hard for us to conceptualize that now, but it wasn't always the case.
Absolutely not. So you never see the word choice associated with freedom when you go back a few hundred years. If you were a noble person in, say, 18th century France, partly what made you free was that you weren't dependent on anyone else, and almost everything in your life was already set. So you didn't have to scramble. You might have already been betrothed to somebody from birth. You already had possessions. You had land. You had an income. You had a status and a name. Choice didn't get you very far. Choice was for people who, had to kind of try to make it on their own. But over time, choice becomes a kind of form of access to both getting what you want and also to a kind of status. I'm the sort of person who gets to make choices about my life. That's a way of saying I'm a full-fledged adult person. And I don't think there's a date you can point to when this happens. But the story that I tell is really about how this happens over a certain number of really centuries. But I don't think it's really solidified till the 20th century. I mean, the 20th century is really when we start to think fundamentally people are free when they can choose things.
I think it must be tied to the Industrial Revolution because beforehand there weren't even enough calories to sustain anything other than the bare rudiments of living. And now that we live in an age of abundance as opposed to an age of scarcity, it is an age of choice.
It's abundance in things. It's also the proliferation of different belief systems, so kind of pluralism in the world of ideas as well as stuff. It's also the rise of cities where people don't all know each other. And so things like, romantic choice aren't between five people you already know and your families know, but between strangers. It's a story that goes along with the growth of the modern world, but it's not just a sort of natural outgrowth, I don't think. of there being more things or abundance. It's also a kind of story about how this idea of choice got so valorized, how we came to turn choice making into something that's a value unto itself, not just a way to get things.
Right. Now, the problem of choice is, I suppose, in some societies, not enough of it, but in our society, it's too much of it. Was there ever an acknowledged equilibrium? We were living in the perfect age of just enough choices?
That's a good question. I think the sort of propaganda around the Second World War is often that there's a certain perfect balance of political and economic freedom. It's a myth too, but that was when you started with FDR. So that was the kind of moment with the celebration of freedom as the hallmark of what made the Allies and especially the US different, either from communist states or from totalitarian ones. Today, we're more likely to complain in some parts of the world about choice overload.
Yes.
You go to Amazon and you want to buy, a toaster, and there's 65 different kinds, and who the hell wants to read about every one of these before picking a toaster, or something like that. And in poorer parts of the world, obviously people are often told that they have choices and they don't have real choices, and they're often penalized for not making good ones. And there's a lot of resentment of a culture, understandably, that insists upon kind of personal autonomy and choice as the way to actualize oneself as a person. So you can see it sort of impinging on our politics in every direction.
Yeah. Remember that Wendy's commercial? Evening wear, and it would be a drab outfit. Formal wear, and it would be the same drab outfit over and over again. The point of Wendy's being, we, as America, have choice, which is like a piece of cheese on the burger or a tomato.
Exactly.
Yeah. What's the difference between, say, voter preference or the choices of the people and the concept of the will of the people?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, the will, as it was defined, and here you're, in a sense, referencing Rousseau in the 18th century, and this idea of a general will. The will was the idea that there was something all the people shared and wanted collectively. And choice, as we talk about it now, is very different. It's much more this sense I mentioned of a kind of aggregated set of everybody's distinct decisions, with the idea that we're very unlikely to agree about much at all. Very minimal area of agreement. And choice also suggests that there are kind of menu of options, whereas the will suggests there's just something human nature requires or demands.
Yeah, it reminds me of something that you've written about, which is the idea of common sense, which maybe seems to be just out there and obvious, but is often a construction that's used as a means of manipulation.
Right, absolutely. Common sense is really interesting in that regard because it would seem to be something that crosses all cultures and all times. And of course, it's not only is it quite specific, people think something's common sense at one time that they don't in another, but the sooner, in politics, if somebody says it's just common sense, you can assume it's a controversial topic because it's almost always used as a kind of the inverse of what you might think. You say gun control and somebody says, just let's use common sense. That generally means there is none.
One area of choice that makes life miserable, I'm told, is dating these days is unbelievably hard because there's so much choice and you could always swipe left and there's no incentive as compared to the days when we were in a village with 200 people and if there was one marriageable young lady and a marriageable young man, they'd get married. Now, I was reading your book about how dance cards were used back in the age of balls. And there is an innovation there, which is someone's dance card can be filled as per the idiom. But if the dance card wasn't filled, a woman who always had the choice would be able to turn down someone, but she couldn't pick someone else. I think that this actually probably alleviated a lot of the psychological angst with that current daters are dealing with today.
There was so much etiquette around dating and dancing in public in the 19th and into the 20th century. I mean, if you read Jane Austen, you can't believe how many things there are you could make a mistake doing. And you might think, oh my God, this was so punishing. Everybody had to know their exact roles, and you couldn't walk this way, and you had to give your left hand to somebody, not your right, and your dance card had to be filled in a very specific way. But the idea was definitely to protect both the social order and to protect individual sentiments. The idea that people could get so hurt by rejection in this kind of public setting, or by monopolizing somebody's attentions and not somebody else's. And so I got interested in these dance cards because I was also interested in restaurant menus and secret ballots and all kinds of things that I would call kind of choice technologies. And there were ways to kind of help you navigate this new world of selection, sometimes other people, sometimes objects, sometimes what you want to have for lunch. And dance cards are a really interesting one because as they proliferated and they made choice easier, they also added in ever more rules, not legal rules, but informal kind of etiquette rules. And
norms.
I think that's, just norms. And I think those are really an important part of this story. You need a lot of rules for choice to work.
Choice without norms is flummoxing, actually more oppressive, leads to greater unfairness. But how do you get the norms in there? You know, a lot of times our current architects of choice, like the people who run the dating companies, they're disincentivized to create norms around it. And maybe that's good short-term thinking, but it's also why these companies actually, the dating apps aren't such great investments.
No, they want you on there as long as possible and swiping right or left as long as you possibly can. And this is true for shopping in general. And, you know, nothing more resembles the world of shopping these days than online dating, because it's really the same model, right? It's like, here's a set of options and keep thinking, which ones do you like? And, you know, and then, of course, the only difference is that the objects have to choose you back when it's dating, whereas I guess the toasters on Amazon don't have to like you the same way.
Would you say the current Cheesecake Factory menu is an analog for our society as a whole?
That's a question I've never gotten before, specifically about Cheesecake Factory. I mean,
this thing. This thing is a tome. This thing has, more entries than the tax code.
Right. And I think that's because people want to feel that more choices, it means more freedom. You have more options. It's sort of the premise is always more is better. However, we also have a lot of trouble navigating too much, which is one reason especially wealthy people employ a whole host of people to help them select things, to curate their homes through decorators and personal shoppers, financial planners, trip planners. I mean, these are all to kind of help you through the idea that the options are vast. And I myself, I don't know about you, but if I see a menu that I have to turn 10 pages on, I give up. I mean, I don't want to read 10 pages of options in a restaurant. I'd rather a few good ones.
Yeah. So what do we make of, I was thinking of one issue where there's a tension between choice and having a choice thrust upon the consumer, and that's gas stoves, which is to say that all choices are a trade-off. But when you have a government policy that doesn't allow, and I could have come up with 100 things, but in this case, gas stoves, because I think that's a pretty fair question about, is the trade-off, is the benefit to the environment worth the fact that they don't, all expert chefs will tell you that an electric stove doesn't cook as well. Plus, there is some aspect of how likely the house is to burn down. So when if a choice has an inherent trade-off that the person has to make, but then the government or some other policy-making institution thrusts that choice upon a person by saying you can't choose the gas stove, how does that work in our current environment where choice is so valorized?
Yes. So, for instance, one of the very first things President Trump did after coming into office in January was announce an increase in what he called freedom of choice around appliances, cars, shower heads, the list goes on, and mainly consumer goods, with the idea that deregulation would lead to greater consumer options, not necessarily lower prices, not necessarily better air to breathe, but basically more things you could choose from amongst. And there are places where we can probably imagine too much regulation has a limited supply of certain kinds of goods. But there are a lot of places where we actually want regulation to limit the supply of goods.
Leaded gasoline. We can't choose that now, and thank God.
Exactly. Right. So that would be the perfect example. A car that's a horrible gas guzzler, we don't want that option, because even if an individual wants it here or there, the collective good, we're all better off if nobody drives that car. Right. So it's a balancing act. And the point is not to always emphasize more is better, but to think clearly about where optionality can exist, but within constraints that are good for all of us.
Yeah. Yeah. So no one wants fewer rights, but we might actually want fewer choices. And if the listener's saying, we never consciously want that, yeah, we do. When we're looking, here's an example you raised. When we're looking at insurance plans, we definitely want fewer choices, right? It's way too flummoxing. So then there's the issue, the political issue, where a politician will try to frame you're being denied a right as taking away or lessening the oppression of choices. On the other side, they might say that no, when they take away your choice, like for a certain kind of light bulb, they're really taking away your rights. Are there ways to look at it that can cut through those arguments that this really is a right and this really is a choice and this really is a choice that can go and maybe will be freeing, but this is the kind of choice that is so bound up to rights that we shouldn't surrender it?
It's a really interesting framing you've just given, because it's true that we've come increasingly to think of rights as having choices in different domains. Rights weren't always framed that way, but increasingly we have said a right to something means the right to choose, usually if you're out of your own pocketbook, but the right to choose from a set of possibilities, whether that's where you want to live, what job you want to do, any of a variety of things. But there are, and this really actually goes back to, you opened with FDR, there might be rights to some things we have collectively. So with your example with cars, if we think we have a right to breathe air that's clean and healthy, well, or we have a right to public health. Yeah. Then you start to say, well, does everybody have also the right to drive that gas guzzling car, or not to wear that mask in a time of a pandemic, or things where it has less to do with the individual simply being able to live the way that person wants to live, which most of us think is a good thing, I think, but where it actually, that choice impinges on the public good in some way. And to a degree that we might make the decision, you really don't have a right to drive the car that gets 2 miles an hour, 2 miles to the gallon or something like that.
Right. But then this is why new regulations are analogized to the older ones that we can almost all agree on were a boon to public health, which means that all the individuals benefited. But you have this gas stove debate, and I don't know how much you've read the research on it. The experimentation, it's far from as clear or as important as eliminating lead gasoline or just gas guzzling.
Yeah, and that might be a place in which you say, look, there's just not enough benefit to restricting this good, and this might be a place in which people like to cook, and this is taking away something really people enjoy with very little real benefit in a world of global warming. It's a much bigger factor. I'm not saying that we should cut out choice everywhere we can. That's hardly my message, but I think we can think about it a little more consciously and strategically.
Yeah, I think it's hard to sell personal enjoyment as in a public debate. It seems selfish, but it's actually like fundamentally, if you want to change the word enjoyment to something like human flourishing, it's why governments exist and societies are organized. Now, I don't know that gas stove is human flourishing, but eating's pretty important too.
Yeah,
and menus are pretty important to the development of humanity.
Happiness indexes around the world now include the ability to choose as one of the indicators of whether people feel some kind of, contentment in their daily life. So I'm hardly here to say that choice is a thing that needs to go away. But the idea that choice is always good and that more choice is always better, more opportunities, more options, actually doesn't
Right,
work out.
right. Because the Bhutanians who have national happiness as part of their consideration for whether they undertake a policy, they also don't have 19 flavors of jam in their supermarkets. I'm going to use plural. Maybe Bhutan only has one, but yeah.
I don't know.
That is true. Yes. So I want to get to the pro-choice movement. Does that fit in? Is that a fair framing? Is that a framing that you understand the rhetorical appeal of, given everything you've studied?
So right after Roe v. Wade was decided, which was 1973, the major feminist organizations in the United States and some of their counterparts in Western Europe too, still had a kind of problem on their hands, which was how to persuade a broad public that abortion was a real option, that it really could be, in a sense, destigmatized in relation to the past. And we can look back at the meeting notes of these different organizations, and it's really interesting. You see, they tried out a lot of different ideas. They thought, maybe we sell this on the basis of equality. In England, it was sold largely on the basis of healthcare. It's been less controversial also in England. In the US, what was decided by Planned Parenthood, by a number of other organizations, was largely this idea of choice. And why? Because it was thought, who could really object? Nobody was saying you have to have an abortion. Nobody was pushing this idea. It was just offering it as one more option. And the idea was that individuals could, based on their same values and predilections and needs, the kinds of basis on which they made all other decisions, decide in this capacity too. And it would allow women to feel like full-fledged choosers, which was really what had become the status of an autonomous person. So in many ways, this made a tremendous amount of sense. And I see why people fell in line with this. And we've had the right to choose and various versions of that ever since. But it also faced a lot of backlash that was probably not expected.
Mm-hmm. And it's inherently American to emphasize that. If you said which society says it's healthcare, which society says it's choice, I would definitely say, oh yeah, the one that has Virginia Slim cigarettes marketing all over the place is the one that's going to frame it as a choice.
Right, and it fit in with human rights language. It fit in with commercial culture. It fit in with politics on both sides of the aisle in the 1970s. I mean, I really think it was seen and it was marketed as a very American idea. Americans like choice, and we're expanding the realm of possibilities. But there was backlash both from the right and from the real left as well, pretty quickly, in ways that are really interesting.
Yeah. Do you think vulnerability of that is, okay, if you're pro-choice, obviously, if that faction gets to define their opponents, they would say anti-choice. But then their opponents actually choose a label of pro-life, which is to say, to cut through and maybe define the question. The opposite of that number would be anti-life. So maybe pro-choice works better than pro-life, but I don't know that anti-choice is more powerful than anti-life.
Nobody proposed anti-choice. It's interesting. That's a non-starter, and it's still a non-starter. Nobody goes into politics and says, I'd like to take away your choices. But on the right, a very clever strategy emerges, which is to say, yes, but isn't there something more important and greater, in a sense, than choice? And that is life itself. And in a way, the right went back to the kind of Hercules choice notion, which there was maybe there's choice, but there's a right choice and there's a wrong choice. It kind of remoralized the options. And now you might say that was purely a cover for a kind of anti-feminist position, and that's a legitimate argument. But if we just look at the rhetorical strategy of arguing that choices have moral grounds and some are more weighty and worthwhile than others, it was a great success what the right proposed. And on the left, and then on the left, there's a clever strategy too. So,
yeah, but I would say that nowadays you hear reproductive rights more often expressed as the legalized abortion movement slogan. And this gets back to what I was saying, that everyone wants more rights. People aren't as clamoring for more choices. So it seems to me that back when this slogan was adopted, I could understand the merits, but the stakes and the salience of the issue were somewhat undermined by pitting it as a choice question. And then they had to react to their opponents framing it as a much bigger issue, a life question. And then the counter mobilization was, all right, now we're going to be a rights issue. And that would be my analysis anyway.
I think that's correct. I mean, you do see a number of organizations backing away from the choice framing these days. Reproductive justice, for instance, is a bigger framing. Even equality, people are still worried about framing in terms of women's equality. But But there is a sense, right, that choice has been a little bit of weak tea to combat an argument as strong as the right to life. Even if the right to life has been attached to something that, might be described as a set of cells with not a child yet, it's simply had a kind of way of turning the anti-abortion position into a morally righteous position.
Yeah, I think that's astute and fair. So my last question is, having been inside this book for so long, did you come up with any strategies in terms of navigating the preponderance of choice that are thrust upon you, even outside a Cheesecake Factory menu setting?
Yeah, it's interesting because I didn't write this in any way to be a kind of self-help book. It wasn't really about how do you deal with choice in everyday life. But I do think there is a kind of payoff to thinking about this history, because it takes something we do so instinctively, so normally all day long, and I hope makes it seem a little stranger and weirder that we're doing this. And in the process gets us to think, when do I really want to invest this kind of energy in choice personally? And when, for instance, as in insurance plans, where you'd rather have one good one than 10 you have to read the fine print and can't understand anyway. And you might also think in a sort of more broadly political way, as in our conversation about cars and emissions, that sort of thing. When is choice the right way to solve a problem, increasing the options? And when is choice actually potentially even detrimental to coming to some better place? And I like to write the kind of history that I hope opens up questions you haven't really noticed before, areas that you haven't thought about. Even if we do them all the time, they're ordinary. And to me, the best thing about history is that it makes you think differently about the present you're in, and maybe even differently about where we should go from there. So that's really my main goal.
And when the publisher presented you with 3 different book covers, did you say, I don't care?
Yeah. I did not. I said, I want a choice. Are you kidding?
Yeah. Sophia Rosenfeld is a professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania, and her new book is The Age of Choice, A History of Freedom in Modern Life. Thank you so much.
Thank you.